I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. Okay, so first of all, this title is a little clickbaity, and so I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry that I made you open a podcast that's titled The Truth About Hormones and Hormone Testing. The truth is that there is only an evolving truth in science, and I want to use this point, I'm proving this point actually, by titling the podcast basically the opposite of what we do continue to pursue in scientific literature, which is the evolution of the knowledge we have and the pursuit of truthness and accuracy versus ever calling something the absolute truth. I want to talk about hormone testing and some various options as far as hormone testing, and we're going to do that on purpose because I want you to be better equipped to be able to navigate what's offered to you as far as hormone support and testing actually goes. I want to go on the record for what it is that I don't like about fancy hormone testing beyond blood testing. And this is probably the number one question I get asked by practitioners. And so I'm excited to share this on a bigger stage for practitioners as well, because I think it's really important that we understand what evidence-based selection of lab work looks like, which is maybe not a skill that we particularly emphasize or spend time on in school. We can tell right from wrong in most medication trials, right? Look, the drug worked, look, the drug didn't work. But we actually need to be able to apply some really good critical thinking when it comes to should I or should I not do a lab test? And that is not something that I see practiced well in the general integrative medicine space. And I want you as the listener patient to be better equipped to say, no, I don't want that lab test. I don't want you to ask for lab tests you don't need. Okay, so the tests I'm kind of referring to, and I've always kind of affectionately nicknamed them fancy lab tests. I'm referring to hormone testing other than blood testing, and that might look like saliva. That might look like the urine steroid hormone testing, which goes by the name the Dutch test. Those are the tests I'm talking about. Now, with the exception of cortisol, because anytime I ever talk about this, someone comes back at me and says, well, what about cortisol? Cortisol can be measured in body fluids relatively accurately, specifically saliva. So if you've had a saliva cortisol test done, fine. If you've had a urinary cortisol test done, that's fine. Often people are having that cortisol testing done in combination with other hormones. That is not fine. You didn't need the rest of all of those things tested. But cortisol can be measured in those other body fluids. So we're going to break this down and walk through how we should be making decisions about whether or not we use lab tests. And I'm going to show you where the gaps in understanding are for specifically the Dutch test and salivary hormone testing as well. The reason I wanted to name this podcast The Truth About Hormone Testing and use my clickbaity way to get you into this podcast is it actually is quite proving a point that I have always said from the very first time I went on air saying I didn't agree with these forms of lab testing. I basically have always used this kind of show me the money approach to anything really, like whether we're talking about homeopathy, whether we're talking about energy medicine, whether we're talking actually I take it back. I have some massive biases against some of those things, and maybe I would never change my mind about them, or the amount of evidence that would need to happen would have to be this heroic amount of evidence to compile against what I already know. But with the Dutch test specifically, I've always been open for there to be more information and more evidence for that test. And to date, there's 1 or 2 trials that really compare it against blood work, saying, yes, it's as accurate as blood work at testing ovulation. Which we'll talk about in a little while, about why that's not good enough. And they're small trials, and they're run by the companies that actually make and produce and profit from this test, which that's really how anything really gets done in research. We can't poo-poo all research that's funded by a company that has a special interest. Otherwise, nothing would ever get done. But given that it's the only study and there's only a couple of women in it, and it, is being used as this basis for why we should consider using this test, then I think that really calls it into question. It's different if that one test that was funded by the company was among a handful of others and they all kind of showed the same thing. This is the only study that we are looking at for the Dutch test to say, yes, it's as good as ovulation. And so I really have an issue with that. I think that if we're going to change the way we approach women's health and we want to call this the next big thing in women's health, can someone please run a study on it? I'm willing to change my mind, right? It's like a total show me the money experience with it. And every time I go to have this conversation, I do go and look to see if there's anything more that's been published. Actually, almost every time I get on stage ever, I look up this test to see if anything else has been published, because this is this thing that everybody wants to ask me about. Like, tell us about the Dutch test, right? They're yelling from the crowd. So I do always update my thoughts about it, and 100%, like, there's nothing there. There's nothing new. We're not even trying by the way it seems. So, and what those tests claim to do is to tell you something so nuanced and so special about your hormone detoxification or metabolism, that we are going to now construct this insanely individualized plan to support you and your symptoms. And I want to break that down a little bit, because I'm going to show you why that's not okay, that we approach cases that way, and why you don't need that. I think you are a wonderful, special, magical unicorn, but you don't need a magical special test and a magical special treatment plan in order to improve the way that you feel. And I do think that sometimes the marketing around these tests preys on the fact that women feel hopeless and unheard in their pursuit of health. And imagine how it feels for someone to say, you know what, we'll figure it out. We can figure out the magical thing that's getting in the way of you feeling better. Right? Of course, we're going to shell the money out, right? Take my money. Please help me. Tell me, why am I so unique? And why is it that I can't get any better? And so it's unfortunate, because I think it speaks to a deeper issue. And I used to be frustrated with people when they had the Dutch test done, and now I'm not. If patients have had the Dutch test done and they bring it to me, actually, they often will say, "Ooh, I know you don't like this." And I actually don't want people to feel that way when they bring me lab work or bring me things that they've tried or done in the past, right? You shouldn't feel shame or regret over the things that you've done. It was partly what got you to where you are now. And if that journey brought you to me and to sit across from me at my desk, I'm happy to be part of that journey for you. And part of how you got there was by doing those other things. So I've definitely softened my approach for when people have had that test done, because I actually think it's part of that desperate feeling of wanting to be heard and listened to and supported. I don't really see it as a negative that you've done it. Okay. I don't want you to do it again. And if you haven't done it, don't. But I'm not upset if you have, right? I think that, I have a much different and more compassionate view over it than I maybe did 10 years ago, when I was, really reading people the riot act if they had had this test done. And even practitioners, I understand why practitioners do it too. I'm not going to make a lot of excuses for practitioners, because I think we have an obligation to challenge our practices all the time and to evolve and get better. And even if you did something in the past consistently with patients, even if you feel in this minute that it worked for people, I would love for you to have an open enough mind that you could maybe challenge that with me today and make a decision not to do it again in the future. And I understand why you did, right? You probably had people that you respected, loved, and trusted share that information with you, right? It probably was passed to you by someone that you admired, or it was offered to you as a solution for some of the challenging cases that we come across, right? Sometimes patients do have those unique cases that it feels like we need to do something special for them to figure it out, and no one else has been able to figure it out. And how is it going to be me? Oh, thank God I have this special, unique test to use. I want you to feel more confident in how to support that as a clinician too. So anyways, I'm kind of digressing a little bit. So let's talk about why we test you in any ways. Like, why do we test ever, right? When we offer to do lab work or don't offer to do lab work, and I do find sometimes patients are frustrated that we don't do more hormone testing, and I'll explain that a little bit, but when we do lab work or any kind of imaging or assessment, it has to do two things. It has to tell us something we don't already know, and it has to change what we're going to do. Right? It has to satisfy both of those things. And then I would argue that the sort of third thing is if we're going to bring in a new or novel test, it has to offer something better than what we've done before. Like, meaning that if we've got this biohacking special test, it has to be better than what we've used in the past, right? If you're going to be the new kid on the block from a lab perspective, you better be faster, cheaper, better, more accurate, more accessible, easier, less invasive. You have to check all those boxes. Otherwise, why would we ever change from what we do or what we did before, right? If it was like, and it is incredibly accurate to test progesterone levels to see if you ovulated, and it's dirt cheap and it's not that invasive, and unless you had a deathly fear of needles and you wouldn't go, there would be no reason to do it any other way. So if you think back to what I said at the beginning, that the only research we have on the Dutch test is that it's as good as blood work for detecting ovulation. Why would we do it any differently? It's more expensive. It's not as accurate. It's not faster. There's nothing about it. It doesn't check any boxes. Nothing about it is making it win. And so why would we do it, right? Why would we do it any differently? So it has to tell us something we don't already know. Now, I think this, for the hormone piece, this is where we struggle with this particular test, because clinicians and patients will argue with me that it is telling us something we don't already know. I didn't know that my estrogen detoxification pathway was compromised. I didn't know that I'm a slow methylator, and so blah, 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 blah. These are the kinds of things that this test says, because basically what the test does is it tests breakdown products of estrogen and progesterone and testosterone in your urine, and then it makes an assumption based on that. And I'm using my words carefully. The word assumption is very appropriate there, that your body is doing something or not doing something based on those metabolites. So if you remember back to like biology class when you're like grade 11, right? And remember those chemical reactions, right? And we'd draw like reagent A, and then there'd be an arrow, and then we'd get to reagent B. And we'd learn about cofactors and substrates and things that would make that arrow work, period. So we need, zinc in order for this arrow to work. We need B12 to make this arrow work. And then we'd learn about things that were either going to make that arrow work faster or make that arrow slow or not work at all. And that's kind of the basis of us understanding our physiology, right? From one chemical to get from chemical A to chemical B, it has to undergo some kind of transformation or change. And quite typically, there is some kind of substrate or cofactor that's going along with it in order for that to happen. What the Dutch test does is it draws out a very intricate pattern of your hormones being metabolized from their parent hormone, which is, estrogen or progesterone. And I've seen, versions where they talk about things like allopregnanolone and some of those other hormones, DHEA. And then it draws like this Christmas tree of how Christmas tree, meaning that like the arrows and it kind of looks like a big triangle, saying, well, it started as estrogen and it gets broken down into all these various metabolites through all of these arrows. And based on what we see coming out in your urine, you are deficient in B6. And it's saying that because it's making an assumption that because those arrows are or aren't working, that must mean something about your physiology. It also is saying that this is meaningful. Like, who cares which version of estrogen we found in your urine? I have yet to find a study that shows me that it matters. It doesn't matter what version of estrogen we find in your urine. It's not telling us about your nutritional profile or your B12 deficiency by testing the estrogen in your urine. It's just not. It's taking something so complicated and so nuanced like hormonal health and trying to distill it down to arrows and reagents and trying to make us understand what's happening in your body. And it's ascribing meaning to things that don't mean anything. The kinds of metabolites in your urine don't mean anything. And there are more accurate ways to test your B12 deficiency than looking at the kind of estrogen that's in your urine. And so that argument that it is telling us something we don't already know by saying, well, this type of estrogen is higher in your urine than in another person. Like, I guess it's telling us something we don't already know, but it doesn't matter. Right? It's not informing clinical decision making. It's not teaching us about what we should do with you. All it's doing is telling us a thing that we found in your pee. We don't have the evidence to say that that's meaningful. Right? It's interesting because sometimes the same people that want to have this kind of test done will skip their mammogram when that is a test that we know what it means. We know if we find something, what to do. We know what it means if you have a clear mammogram. But for some reason, we're willing to skip on very well-established screening tests and assessment in favor of a novel thing that has no evidence for it. So it does tell us something I didn't know what kind of urine steroid hormone metabolites I had, I guess. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to my health. We have not been able to link up those steroid hormones with pathology. And so it doesn't matter what the answer is. The other side of it is that we are poor at assessing hormonal conditions in general. And I think part of that's because it actually relies on a good history taking. There was a study, and I cite it all the time, and I wish I was better at remembering author names. But they basically said we can actually achieve an accurate diagnosis of early ovarian failure if we talk to patients longer than 5 minutes. But if patients were only talked to for 3 minutes, we missed the diagnosis more often. I mean, just bizarre, right? That we even need to run this study. But it really speaks volumes to why we struggle so much with hormonal health is because of the style that we approach that interview, that healthcare interview. It's 7 minutes, right? The average healthcare appointment is like 7 to 9 minutes or something like that. We're not doing that much better than that stupid study that showed that if we talk to you for 3 minutes, we're going to miss your early menopause. And I think that's why people gravitate towards my practice or naturopathic doctors in general, because we talk to you so long, we're going to figure it out, right? By the end of it, I know your favorite food, I might know your favorite color, and I know the name of your spouse. And so, yes, I'm going to figure out what's wrong with your hormonal health only because I have this luxury of talking to you for so long. It's not that it's so deeply complicated to figure out if it's perimenopause or postpartum challenges or PMS that's amplifying your other mental health condition, or whether it's IBS versus PMS bloating. It's actually not that hard. It just takes time. And time is something that we've stripped away from medical appointments to the detriment of patients. So of course you're going to feel like nobody knows what's going on with you. They don't talk to you long enough to know what's going on with you. And so now we gravitate to this test instead, thinking, well, no one seems to know, so I'll do this. Right? But that argument of the Dutch test is telling me something I don't know. I would argue that you just haven't asked the right questions. You haven't talked to the patient long enough. You haven't had a chance to tell someone your story from start to finish. That's why they think they need to use the test on you. That's why you feel like you need the test. It's not telling us something we don't already know. We just haven't asked. The other piece is that it really doesn't inform treatment. And so this other thing that lab tests are supposed to do, they have to tell us something we don't already know, and they have to change our treatment. And when practitioners are really bent out of shape that I say I don't like this test, they're like, well, it helped me figure out how to treat my patient's acne. And what I always say back is, okay, if I tied your hands behind your back and said you can't do the test, what would you do for someone who had acne? And the interesting part is that their answer would be the same. We'd still use zinc. We'd still talk about nutrition. We'd still talk about face washing. We might talk about topicals. There was nothing that you learned from that test that should have changed your treatment. And the reason behind that is that in the studies that use zinc for acne, not a single one of them did it on the basis of testosterone levels. Not a single study that uses benzoyl peroxide ran a Dutch test first. Not one. So it didn't matter why people had acne. It didn't matter what their hormones were in their urine. They gave them all the same treatment and it worked. So why do we feel like we need to wait for this test to tell us what to do? You already should know what to do, because none of those solutions were done on the basis of this test. Now, there are other things that we do for patients that we need to know the answer to a lab test before we do the treatment, or we'd change our mind about what we did with them because of the lab test. I wouldn't treat someone's iron deficiency if they didn't have it, so I do the lab test. But the Dutch test doesn't inform what you do because we should have done that other treatment anyways, right? We shouldn't have waited for the test. So maybe you feel like it told you what to do if you're a practitioner, or you feel like it told your doctor what to do with you because you're so unique as a patient. But the reality is we had the evidence for what to do with you before we ran the test. It didn't change what we do. It didn't inform anything. The last thing, nope, that's probably not the last thing. The other thing, I could talk about this for days. The other thing I want to say about this particular test, and saliva testing is in there too, although I would say by trend, the saliva hormone testing is being done less often because it's not as new and special and magical and funky as the urine test. But the thing is that test is not diagnostic. So let's just say for argument's sake, there actually is something really wrong with you that needs to be tested. That test that's looking at the last step of a 1,000-step process, right? It's looking at the estrogen in your urine. What happens if it's low? Do we learn anything? What happens if the progesterone's low, right? I said at the beginning, it confirms ovulation with progesterone, but what happens if it's low? Did we learn anything? And so sometimes women will feel like their hormones are high or low, but what they don't know is why. And that test doesn't teach us why. It just tells us what is, if we believe it. If we think it's accurate, all it's saying is high, low. It's not saying why. When we assess the endocrinology of a woman, we don't test the last step of a 1,000-step process as the only thing we look at. We can't. It doesn't teach us anything. Every single pathology that's related to hormones, every single symptom that's related to hormones has a process for us to work it up, and it involves looking at hormones that are not in the urine. So there are hormones that are produced by your brain. There are some hormones produced by your adrenal glands. There are some hormones produced by your ovary. And if we really want to understand the story, don't you think we should test all of them? And so when we look at steroid hormone metabolism and someone brings me their Dutch test and says, my estrogen's low and my progesterone's low, I have no idea if that's because they're in menopause, or if it's because they have anorexia, or if it's because they just came off the pill, or if it's for some other reason that's suppressed or prevented ovulation that's made those hormones low. The only way I would know that is if I actually test their brain-based hormones. So when I say the Dutch test isn't diagnostic, that's why. It doesn't actually tell us why. It just tells us what is, if we believe it. So I'm gonna leave us with I'm gonna call it the rebuttals or the but Jordans, because every time I have this conversation, no matter how compelling I feel like I'm being about it, and like I said, show me the money. If someone honestly, anytime I've gotten into an argument about this online, I've said, send me the paper, and they send me one of two. I'm happy to change my mind. I change my mind all the time. I change my practice all the time, because that's the beauty of being in science and being in medicine. The thing we think today is not what we're going to think 2 weeks from now. And we need the capacity to be able to evolve what we do in practice. I can't wait for hormonal care to be better than it is. I am the biggest advocate for advancement in science there is, especially with respect to women's health. I can't wait for there to be a better way for us to assess women. I can't wait to incorporate something into my practice that is deeply going to change the game. This isn't it. Or if it is, I don't have the evidence for that yet. And the patients that I work with, and I know I'm not for everybody, the patients that I work with are not the ones that are looking for experimental solutions. They're not people that are looking for something that's so brand new that we don't know if it works yet. Some people do. Some people do want that. If you are, if you subscribe to biohackers today, or, you want the crazy new, even if it's experimental, and you believe it, even if it's experimental, like, that's great. The women that I work with are the ones that want pragmatism, logic, evidence. If you want something different, or if you practice different, that's okay. Let's just not argue that we're talking about the same thing, because we're not. Anyways, the but Jordans are often like, well, Jordan, that test is icing on the cake, and it doesn't replace my physical exam and my history taking and the other blood work I would do. And my answer to that is like, well, why are you doing it, period? Right? If we're calling it icing on the cake, like it's not really needed or necessary, and I'm not relying on it, but I'm going to do it anyways. Well, I mean, I guess frame it for your patients that way, though, because when I say, we're getting to the end of the line of what we need to do, there's some nice to knows over here, or some frilly things we could do. You could put a cherry on top of this sundae if you want. Patients often don't want that. They want basic. They want practical. They want cheap. Let's be real, right? We all do. We all want that. So let's not pretend that we're using it as icing on the cake, because my argument there is like, well, just don't ice the cake. You don't need it. The other thing that often will get put out to me is, well, it taught me that this one patient I had this, and use this one example as a reason why we should do it in everyone. Having something work in one person isn't a good enough reason for us to apply it to everybody. And I shouldn't even have to say that. We call that N of 1 in research. Like, if we have the N of 1, the study of one person whose acne got better because they did this test, I don't think that's good enough for me. I wouldn't bet on that, right? I wouldn't gamble my money away if they said, well, this one time the stars aligned and this miracle eclipse happened. I wouldn't put my money down on that. I'd be like, well, what happens on all the other days? That's what I want to put my money towards. And so I think when we hear practitioners say, well, this one time at band camp, we really have to question, the rationale behind using it in everyone just because one person saw benefit. Because my argument there is that one person's benefit was misascribed to the test. They didn't get better because they did the test. We didn't need the test to know how to treat them. The test didn't tell us what was wrong with them. They happened to be both done in the same patient. We did the test and they got better, mutually exclusive. And so these arguments around why this test needs to be done, the last one that will often get put to me is like, well, I don't make money. I don't mark the test up. I don't make any money off the test. That doesn't mean we should waste money on it, right? Someone made money. Doesn't mean we should spend money on something just because nobody profited from it, or we have the illusion that nobody profited from it. That's not a good enough reason not to continue doing it either. So I want you to come away from this thoughts and conversation, and I feel like this is one of the more poignant podcasts I've recorded in a long time. I want you to come away from this realizing that like there really should be a very systematic, evidence-based way that we make all clinical decisions. I know right now I'm talking about a lab test, and one that has had a tremendous amount of press and airtime, even though it really doesn't deserve it. But all treatments are like this. Brand new special hair serum, right? Special, never been done before iron supplement, right? All decisions we make in medicine really should follow similar guidelines around how and when and why we would consider doing it. And we need to consider the cost and the accuracy and the pragmatism and the ability for you to comply and incorporate it into your life, the accessibility. What is it actually doing for us? All of those things need to be considered before we make a decision, and lab tests are no different. It's a slightly different set of criteria we use, but we still want the answer to be the same. This is better. Our life is better. Our decision making is better than if we had never done it. And my argument, and I'm willing to be wrong, is that this particular test doesn't do any of it. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. We're changing things in women's health. One episode, one topic, one conversation at a time. I want you to feel confident in your health. Please remember that the podcast does not constitute a medical relationship or medical advice. Please talk to your family doctor, your practitioner, your specialist, or anyone on your health team if you think some of the topics we discussed in today's episode apply to you. Take care of yourself. Until next time.